Good evening. Can you guys hear me? Is this a good volume for what we're doing? Should we turn it up? Okay, we're getting yes from the back row. All right. Should be good. Welcome to a conversation about race in America with Tony Dungy. Hosted by All Things New Church and actually Gillum Community Church. David, the pastor, is right over there. They graciously rent us their space on a week-to-week basis. My name's Justin Eugene. I'm the pastor of All Things New. I want to give you guys a couple of logistical things since, it's COVID and we're in this space that nobody's been in before. If anybody needs to use a restroom, you can go around the building right here, and the first doors you come to, you can go in. There's a double set of doors. Just go straight across the hall, and the bathrooms are in there. There's also a drinking fountain if anybody needs that. With the COVID thing, keep as much social distance as appropriate, and you can if you came with other people or if you've been with those people, you can sit with them. I'm glad that kids are here. I think this is a really important conversation for kids, but I also know that if we sit here for an hour, some of them are going to get antsy and wander back into the field. That's totally cool. I think the mic's loud enough that you'll be able to hear everything that is going on. I know many of you are guests of our church. Welcome. Really glad that you're here. Since we're a church, we're coming from the perspective of followers of Jesus, and so many of the things that we say are going to be directly from that perspective. If that's not where you're at right now, that's totally okay. We're glad that you're here, and what we want to do is engage this issue of racial justice rightly as followers of Jesus, but also listen to those who are in different places than we are and who come from different perspectives. So there will be a Q&A, and we're going to do it a little differently. So if you are interested in asking a question, we've got a set of questions we're going to go through. But if anywhere along the way you want to ask a question, instead of just yelling it out, I'm going to give you my phone number. So you guys want to take out a phone? If you think you might want to text me, you don't have my phone number. I don't see anybody getting them out, so maybe nobody wants to. But I know Daryl has his phone out already, and he's got my number. So I think many of you do anyway. But it's 971-645-0466. And it'll be right here. And if anywhere along the way you're like, hey, we want to follow up on that. We want Tony to say more about that. Go ahead and text it to me, and we'll see if we can make that dynamic work. Now, I find it a bit surreal that I'm hosting this conversation, right? Since our church is like 60 people, including the kids. And until 2 weeks ago, I had never met Tony. But shortly after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Tony shared a response via Twitter that I found incredibly wise and helpful to my personal processing of that. And so I passed it along to our church in my weekly email. And later that week, as we were sitting around, zooming around, we were zooming, is that the proper way to say that? Like having a conversation with some people from church via Zoom, Sarah Booth mentioned that Tony lived right down the street. God, I thought, how cool would it be to have Tony come and talk to our church? And Sarah's like, well, I'll ask him. So long story short, here we are. But when it comes to this issue of racism, I'm late to the party. Because in Eugene, it was easy to be. I grew up in Springfield, and I was trying to remember back to my first interactions around race. And even the first black person I knew, I couldn't come to one until I was 17. Right? That's a long time of my life to have not processed any of these issues. And so it was incredibly easy and frankly way more comfortable to just avoid these conversations, avoid any issues of justice unless I was the one who was wronged. But I also recognize that throughout American history, the church has often been silent, complicit, or shamefully, the perpetrators when it comes to racism. But if we believe as Jesus taught, and frankly as the whole Bible teaches, that justice and freedom from oppression are at the very heart of God, then the lingering, pervasive racism alive and well in America is not something we have the luxury of avoiding if we want to follow Jesus with integrity. And like many of you may be, I'm pretty frustrated with the polarization, the politicization that is currently happening around the issue of race. So much of it is associated with political ends of the spectrum, both sides, and too often people are just taking a position of one of those sides, insisting that they're right and they're being defensive instead of trying to find a productive path forward. And when that's the case, I feel like everybody loses. Society loses. Humanity loses. And we're hosting this tonight because we think the church should be a part of the solution. And the best way we know how to start is by having a conversation and then listening. So at the moment, I don't have a solution. I'm still learning. And one of my occupational hazards I always joke about as a pastor is I do a lot of my learning with a microphone that's being recorded in front of people that don't necessarily agree with me, right? And so a lot of the things that I say, I want to reach back and take them back and put them back in my mouth because they're not completely formed ideas, because I'm a human being who's a work in progress and learning how to follow Jesus like I say I want to follow Jesus. And so I confess that my experience is limited and thoughts not fully developed. And sometimes I'm not even asking the right questions, but I think it's vital that we continue to lean in and to ask the questions. that we as Christians lean into the issue and we do it first by listening. So with that in mind, that's my forward to the whole thing. We've invited Tony Dungy to join us today, not to tell us what to do or just give a celebrity opinion, but to share his experience as a black man, father, and leader whose primary identity is found as a child of God and a follower of Jesus. So real quick, I'll let him tell you more, but if you're not familiar with Tony, he played in the NFL. Did you won 1 or 2 Super Bowls as a player?
1.
He won 1 as a player, and then he was the first black coach to win the Super Bowl as a coach. In his retirement, he's the father of 10 children. 8 of them are adopted and still live at home, so you don't have much going on. He's also a mentor and a speaker, a commentator for NBC's Football Night in America. He's also one of the most genuine, thoughtful, and humble people that I've had the privilege of meeting, and I've only known him 2 weeks. So while he's spoken to stadiums full of people, professional athletes, and leaders all over the country, he's here tonight to have a conversation with us. So would you guys please welcome Tony Dungy?
Thank you very much.
It should be on.
Thank you.
Can you hear him right there?
Can you hear that? Okay, thank you.
Turn him up? Okay. We're just going to go turn your microphone up
All
a
right.
little bit.
I have a pretty soft voice. So. How is this? Can you hear that better? A little bit better?
Wait a second, I might
Maybe
turn the wrong one
louder?
up. Keep going.
Okay, how's now? There we go. That's what I always had to tell them, to turn my microphone up. My boss at NBC says the same thing.
All right, well,
So,
I'll start by asking you to just tell us a bit of your story. Where did you grow up? What was it like? What was your experience of growing up as a black boy and then a black man in America?
yeah, I grew up in a small Midwestern town, Jackson, Michigan. It's right in the middle of the state of Michigan, probably 1/3 the size of Eugene. Very small. And I grew up in the 50s and 60s in an automotive industry. Everything kind of revolved around cars and building cars and keeping cars going in the state of Michigan at that time. I think I had the best of all worlds in terms of getting to know this racial process. Our town was small, but where I lived ended up being a predominantly African American neighborhood. And I lived there all of my childhood except for 3 years. When I was in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, my dad was studying to get a PhD. And so he was at Michigan State University. So those 3 years we lived on the Michigan State campus, and we lived in the married housing, and it was a predominantly white area. So 90% of my childhood was predominantly black, and then 3 years were predominantly white. So I got to see all sides of things. It really was kind of interesting growing up in Jackson. I remember when I was 3 years old, we moved houses, just 5 or 6 blocks. And my dad wanted a bigger house. I had twin brother and sister who were 3 years younger than me. When they were born, we moved into a bigger house. And the neighbors at that house were white, people closest to us. And pretty soon, they started moving out. And I remember I asked my dad, "Where's Timmy?" And he said, "Well, they moved." And it didn't really bother me or make a difference to me because I had more friends come in, and the family that moved in there just happened to be black. And then 2 houses down, the same thing happened. What happened to my friend Billy? Well, they moved. And more friends came in, but they happened to be black. Well, by the time my brothers and sisters were 3 or 4 years old, the neighborhood was all black. And I didn't know why that happened. I didn't know what happened. And it didn't even register to me as a young kid. And then we went to Michigan State and we moved in, and it was a different kind of neighborhood. It was all white. And I ended up going to school with a lot of white friends and making friends and having fun just like kids do. Well, then we came back in 6th grade. I went back to my old school. It's predominantly black again. And then 7th grade, that's when they had middle school. And that's when I found out that we had to be bused to where the middle school was. And now we're in a situation where the school was predominantly white, but our group was bused there. And I couldn't understand, I didn't know why we had to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and get up early and catch the bus and ride. We just thought that's the way it was, and that's where the school was. But at that time, there was a lot of busing that was going on to integrate schools and get black and white students living together and going to school together. And that's kind of how I grew up. And to me, again, I had a lot of friends, black friends and white friends. I ended up being in sports, and so I had black teammates and white teammates, and I thought that's just the way the world was, and everything was that way. As I got older, I started to see some of the separations, some of the problems, some of the issues that we're seeing today, but as a kid, I didn't see any of that.
When did you first realize that the story of your friends moving away had something to do with the system and the way the world was? Like, you didn't realize that when they were happening when you were young, right?
Yeah, my dad tried to kind of explain it to me, but being young, I didn't really totally understand. Well, Timmy and Billy, some people don't like to live around us. And so when we moved here, they moved. And hey, it didn't matter to me because Daryl moved in and Darnell moved in, and I had friends, so it wasn't that big a deal. And I didn't understand it. Just like we moved, they moved. And it didn't really register. But later on, I understood why.
Yeah, some little kids just want to play catch and ride bikes, right? So
Exactly.
you're not thinking on
Yeah.
that level. Were there some moments growing up that you were exposed to maybe overt racism? Some moments you can look back on and say, "Gosh, that was a significant thing, where I was treated differently."
You know, I didn't really see it too much growing up, and we had differences of opinion, and we had, you know, when I got to middle school and there were black students and white students, you had confrontations and arguments, and then it became a we and they type thing, which I had never really seen before. But then when I got to high school, the high school, we were still getting bused there. It was predominantly white high school. We had, I think, 9 black players on the football team. And my senior year, they were selecting captains. I was picked as one of the captains. My best friend, another black young man that I grew up with, who was a really good player, I thought he was going to be selected the other captain, and he wasn't. And some of the people in the town told me, well, the school's never had 2 black captains, and I don't think they would go for that. And that hurt me. That was the first time I really thought that somebody, because of the color of our skin, somebody was making a difference. So I quit.
Oh. You quit the team?
I quit the team. And I said, I'm just going to play basketball. If this is the way the football team is going to be, I'm going to quit. My dad...
It didn't take, did it? The quitting football?
Well,
I mean, you kind of came back to it.
I did come back to it, but my dad wouldn't tell me what to do. And he wouldn't say, you know, hey, you need to play in this. He just said, is what you're doing going to make the situation better? And I said, I don't know that it'll make it better, but I'm not going to play for an organization that's not going to treat us right. So I had made up my mind to quit. My middle school assistant principal called me in the middle of the summer, and I hadn't seen him in 3 years. But he called me and said, hey, you got to come over to my house. Word on the street is you're not going to play football. And so I went over to see him, and I said, no, you're right. That word is right. I quit, and here's why. And he looked at me, and he said, well, I don't know if that's right or wrong or true or how you feel, but even if it is the truth of what happened, why would you let someone else take away something that you really like to do? And when I thought about it that way, I said, yeah, that isn't very smart. And he talked me into going back out and playing, and I'm glad he did, because if he hadn't, I wouldn't be sitting here with you today. But that's the first time I really thought about it. I was 16 at the time. And then I thought about, well, when something wrong happens, you really have 2 options. You can be mad about it and quit and give up, or you can say, what can I do to make the situation better? So I went back out and played, and the 9 other black players came back. They all quit when I quit.
Okay.
And we came back, and we had a wonderful year, and I ended up getting a scholarship to the University of Minnesota, and that really jump-started my college life and my professional career.
Yeah, so along the way, were there moments, maybe in college or professionally, both in playing and coaching, that you realized that there was still some racism under the surface, something built into the system that that affected outcomes?
I played quarterback my whole life. I was always the quarterback from the time I was 5 years old, and I was the leader and a good player. I got to the University of Minnesota and I played quarterback, and I remember playing a game my senior year. I was playing quarterback. I was an African American quarterback, which was kind of rare at the time, but I was leading the Big Ten in passing. We played the University of Washington. A guy named Warren Moon was playing for the Huskies.
He was okay.
He was okay.
He was okay.
And they were leading the pack. At that time it was Pac-8, but Pac-12, he was leading them in passing. And it was kind of a big game build-up, 2 African-American quarterbacks, and both of them doing really well. And they beat us that day, sad to say, but the outcome of that was neither one of us ended up getting drafted because there weren't African American quarterbacks in the NFL at that time. So I ended up switching positions and played defense when I went to Pittsburgh. Warren wanted to continue to play quarterback, so he went to the Canadian League and starred up there and won 5 championships in a row, and then came back and built a Hall of Fame career as a quarterback. But I guess that was the first time I saw it on an athletic field, that we were good enough to play in high school and good enough in college, but we can't play in the pros, and we don't even get a chance to show if we can do it or not. And Warren did end up coming back and show that he could do it. Nowadays you look and it's Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson and Russell Wilson, and it's not even thought about. But at that time it was difficult.
What kind of emotional impact did that have on you? How did you process through that and continue to move forward as a defensive back, but then get into coaching?
Yeah, I thought when it happened that, well, maybe the NFL is different, maybe the guys are better, and I do need to switch positions. So I went there and I did. But then as we started playing against other teams and I started seeing some of the other quarterbacks, I thought, yeah, I could do this. So that's when it kind of hit me that maybe there's something more to it, that it was a racial component. But I tried by that time. I was a little bit more mature. I had grown as a Christian, and I stopped trying to necessarily figure things out and do things my own way. I just felt like, okay, this is what God wanted. This is the plan that he had for me. So I'm going to make this work. And as my dad would say, do the best I can to make the situation better. I found out that God's plan wasn't really for me to be a great player and play a long time. I only played 3 years, and then I ended up going into coaching. Coach Noel, who had got me to Pittsburgh, he asked me to come on his coaching staff, and then I ended up coaching for 28 years, and that was really what God was training me to do.
So as you were interviewing for coaching jobs, we had a conversation last week, but there were some dynamics in some of your interviews that brought some of that out. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, you ask how race, plays into it, and again, you don't really see it. You're not looking for that, and sometimes it's very, very subtle. When I got to the National Football League in 1977, there were 28 teams, and there were only 10 African-American assistant coaches in the entire league. So when I got to Pittsburgh, we were winning Super Bowls. We didn't have an African-American assistant coach on the staff. And nobody really thought twice about it. Hey, we've got good coaches, we're winning, what's the difference? So I played the whole time there and never played for an African-American coach. And then when Coach Noel hired me, because he knew me, I was the only one on the staff. My wife Lauren is sitting there. She was the only African-American wife on the staff. And people didn't think that was a big deal. 8 years later, I went to Kansas City, and we were the only African Americans on the staff. And
what years were that? Just
that
for context.
1990, 1991. Yeah, there were no African American head coaches. Many staffs didn't have any assistants at all, and in most places there would be one. And it's kind of funny looking at it now that you see all these players, and hey, it's by merit in terms of playing. We're going to have the best players. But then when you talk about staff and personnel jobs and all the different jobs that take place in the building, it just didn't seem to be fair and open.
Yeah. So you mentioned one other story when we talked about when you were interviewing, they told you something about your staff.
So I was 25 years old when I started coaching. Worked in Pittsburgh. We were winning. I was getting a lot of notoriety, and people were saying this guy's going to be a head coach at some point. He's a good coach, and he's going to move up the ladder. And for 5 or 6 years, it didn't happen. I would have interviews and wouldn't get the job, and people would say, well, he's going to be a head coach, and we can't understand why he didn't. A lot of people blamed it on my Christian beliefs more than anything. Well, he's soft-spoken, he doesn't curse, he doesn't yell at people. That's probably why he's not getting these jobs. But I had an interview with one owner, and it was going really well. And matter of fact, halfway through, I called Lauren, and I said, I think we're going to get this job. Things are really looking good, and they're working pretty well, and this guy really likes me. And we proceed on through the second half of the interview, and then he asked me if I did get the job, who would be some of the coaches I would hire. And I rattled off a list of guys who I knew who were really good coaches, and 5 or 6 of them happened to be African American. And at the end of the interview, he said, I don't think our town is ready for that. And he didn't hire me.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's
And
still
that
alive,
was,
right?
and I'll tell you, that was 1995, and in a sport where you say everybody's trying to win, and an owner, he wants to win a Super Bowl, and it wouldn't matter to him, but he did want to win a Super Bowl, but he just felt like, I don't know if I get the support if I hire an African-American coach and he brings in all of these African-American coaches, and then maybe he has a lot of African-American players. Even if we win, will that be the right thing to do? And he didn't do it.
Right. I think even to this day, right, the ratio of black players in the NFL to black coaches in the NFL, right, the ratio isn't representative.
Yeah, there are about 70% African-American players in the NFL, and there are 3 African-American head coaches out of 32. So it is a different ratio.
So would you say, as far as just equality in race in those areas, we haven't arrived yet as a culture?
We haven't in the leadership positions. We have not in sports and in the NFL in particular looked at it and said, you know what, it doesn't matter what race someone is. Leadership is leadership. Winning is winning. I don't think it's seen that way.
Do you have a sense of why we're not there yet, of some of the underlying things that just you can see from your vantage point of being involved deeply in specifically the NFL, but you're talking and speaking with people all over the country about these kind of things?
You know, I think as younger people come up, I think we make progress, but you know, in my dad's generation, I remember very vividly when I was about 6 years old, we had a little small black and white television, and we're watching TV, and George Wallace was the governor of Alabama, and he was standing on the steps in front of the University of Alabama and saying, we will never have a Negro student in this school. And the National Guard was there, and they were trying to have these 2 black students admitted, and he was standing in the door, and he wasn't going to let them do it. And I remember asking my dad, what is this all about, and how could this happen? And my dad saying, you know, there are some places and there are some minds that are closed, and they don't want people that don't look like them going to school there. And my dad, believe it or not, had fought in World War II. My dad enlisted out of high school. He wanted to help the country in 1944. The war was going on, and he wanted to go in the Air Force. And he couldn't do it. So he had to go to Tuskegee, Alabama, and be in a special unit of all black airmen called the Tuskegee Airmen. And so that was 1944. In 1966, 7, there's no black students at the University of Alabama. And that mindset is, we're chipping away at it, but it's still there in some cases. And I think with our older NFL owners, they still have a little bit of that mindset of, I don't know if African Americans are the right people to lead my team. They can play and do well, and they can do certain things, but can they really be the leaders? I think there's still a little bit of that goes around.
Change just takes a long time. It always has. It always does. Are there still currently, like, what actions or attitudes or responses from white Americans are the most discouraging or disheartening to you?
I think the discouraging thing to me is that owner who would say, I don't believe that myself, but I don't know if everybody else is ready for it. I don't know if our fans are ready for it, so therefore I'm not going to do it. When people say, I'm not like that, but there's nothing we can do, I don't think that's a Christ-like solution. I think Jesus would say there are things we can do, and there are things we should do. And I think specifically, you talked about the church as being silent. I don't think we can continue to be silent. I don't think that's what God wants us to do.
What are one or two key things that you wish, if you could just, all of a sudden, all white Americans would know these things, right? What are a couple things that you wish white Americans understood about maybe the situation of our culture or the attitudes that are still prevalent?
I think, and we're all guilty of it, that we don't really look at things until they impact us. Hey, I see this on TV, I see this happening somewhere else, I see this happening in Springfield, but it doesn't really happen to me, so therefore I'm not going to get involved, or it's not that big of a deal. I think we've got to really have empathy for our fellow man and for our country. And our country's not going to get better if we don't try to make things better. So I think just in terms of saying, even if it hasn't happened to me, even if it doesn't impact me, if it impacts our city, if it impacts our country, we need to do what we can to do something about it.
Yeah, that's a good word. So you said your father was really impactful in your life, and now you're a father of 10 children. What are the biggest things children, preteens, kids here should know about race and racism? How do you approach it with your kids? How should we approach it with ours?
I think the biggest thing we have to do is really, and I do think it starts at home, that we've got to teach our kids that regardless of what they see on television, regardless of what they hear from other people in the neighborhood, regardless of what they hear from anyone else, we're going to treat everybody fairly, treat everybody the same. And in our house, this is how we're going to do it. And that's the thing that my mom and dad did that I think benefited me more than anything else. As I would see these things on TV and I'd ask questions, or I'd say, hey, why did Timmy and Billy, why did they move? And my parents would explain it to me. They would always come back to God and how He wants us to act. And in our house, we aren't going to do that. Even if people don't treat you the right way, we aren't going to do that. We're going to treat everybody the same. We're going to love the way Jesus would say love. And that's what Lauren and I have tried to do with our kids. And they will have situations that will come up at times. Our son Eric, the reason we're here in Eugene, our son Eric played at the University of Oregon. He was a football player, played in high school, and got a scholarship here. As his junior year in high school, again, he was going to a predominantly white high school, and we got a letter that came to our home unaddressed, and it said, you so-and-so black people keep coming into our school to take the football positions. You need to go to another school, and we don't want you here. And this was 2008, not that long ago. And Eric, we were we're nervous for him. We ended up hiring a detective to kind of watch him for a few weeks as he was going in and out of the school and coming home and going, and it was something that our younger kids wouldn't have really understood. Why did people not want Eric to play? I mean, we'd go out to the games, they'd watch him and cheer for the team, and everybody's cheering and think, man, this is great. Ended up winning the state championship, and our little kids still remember going to the games and having fun, but they don't know about that letter, that there are some people that didn't want Eric to play there.
And so the experience of growing up in America, growing up anywhere, is different for every single person. And so you can't just paint with a single brush. Growing up black in America was like this for everybody. You told a story about, I think it was Eric, or was it one of your other sons, driving in a car with three friends. Could you just tell us about that story?
Well, Eric did end up staying there playing, and he had three other black friends that he would pick up and take to practice, especially if they had an early practice, or he'd drive them home. So one Saturday they had an early practice. He's getting up, picked them up, and he's kind of rushing to get there. Driving too fast, and went through a red light. And sure enough, policeman behind him pulls up behind him and stops him. And Eric, telling us the story, says, "Hey, I knew exactly what I'd done. I was driving too fast. I wasn't paying attention. And I didn't know how I was going to tell you guys I just got a ticket." That's what he was concerned about. The policeman comes up to him, asks him what's going on, checks his license and everything. Eric tells him the story. He's going to Plant High School. He's trying not to be late for practice. And the policeman's kind of a fan. And he says, "Just drive safer, please slow down and drive safer." And he lets him go, just gives him a warning. Eric said the three guys that were with him were so nervous and so afraid that they couldn't even practice, because their experience with the police when they had gotten stopped, or when friends of theirs had gotten stopped, was not good. And they felt that something bad was going to happen. In Eric's mind, it never even went through, because that wasn't his experience. But for many young black men, that is the case. And that's something, again, that we have to kind of work through. And everybody's experience isn't the same. You can't paint everybody with that type of brush.
So how do we approach different people who have different experiences of that? Like, especially as white people listening to people's experiences and stories, how do we validate
I think the
where they're
first
coming
thing
from?
we have to understand is we can't just say, "Oh, that could never happen." I think that's one of the great things that, God uses everything for good. And this George Floyd situation was terrible. And it's hard to think of something good that came out of that, but I think that cell phone video has made people not sit there and say, "That could never happen." When people tell stories like that, "Oh, I don't believe that could happen." So I think that's the number one thing, that we've got to listen, we've got to empathize and say, "You know what, maybe that couldn't happen to me, maybe I've never heard of that happening, but it could happen. And we've got to do something about it, or we've got to help when it does happen."
When we see something like that, most of us right away want to solve it. We want to fix it. And there's so many different ways that people are doing it. And they're attached to a lot of different movements and ideas, some of which it's easy to get behind, some of which it's more difficult to get behind. And a lot of it at the moment centers around law enforcement. And you mentioned that you have some friends in a Bible study with you who are law enforcement professionals, right? How has talking with them and then talking with other black friends, how has that changed your perspective? How do we work those things out?
It is a tough dichotomy, and we can't paint everybody with one brush. The policeman can't look at a group of young black students and say, "Well, they do this because they're black." And then we can't look at the policeman and say, "They do this because they're policemen." I remember a couple of years back in our couples Bible study, we have two officers and their wives in our couples Bible study. And there was a situation like this. Something happened, and it was mistreatment, and an unarmed person got shot. And I remember, a couple of people in our group saying, "Oh, this is terrible, and look what the police did." And one of those guys in our Bible study said, "Well, you don't understand our side of it, and we're not excusing that, but hey, I get called and on my headphone, and they say, 'Hey, there was a convenience store that just got robbed. There were 3 people there. One of them is armed.' And then I pull up, and I see 3 people, and I stop them, and I say, raise your hands. And 2 of them raise their hands, and 1 doesn't. Because he says, you aren't going to treat me like that. What am I under arrest for? Why are you stopping me? He said, I don't know if he's armed or not. But I ask him to raise his hand, and he doesn't. And then there's a sudden movement. What do? I know somebody there, I got told someone has a weapon. Do I wait and see if it's him or not? That's what's going through my mind. And that was the first time I thought about it from the policeman's side of things. I'd always thought of it from the person being stopped. And I think that's what we have to do, is we have to try to look at it from the other point of view sometimes.
From the place we're starting, and we're all starting from just different places, how do we go about hearing those other perspectives that we need to hear from?
I think we have to listen, and we have to try to listen without being defensive. Our human nature is to get defensive. Hey, if you make a statement to me, you're coming at me, you're attacking me. And that may not be your purpose at all. You're just trying to give me some information. So I've got to listen, I've got to take it in and have a good heart. But all of this really, it starts with Christ. I think God is going to be the solution, and Christ in us is going to be the solution. It's not going to be through legislation. It's not going to be through protests. It's going to be through us modeling Christ to each other.
So when it comes to the bigger issues of racism in America, what are some of the biggest obstacles that still need to be overcome?
I think we've got to get over fear, number one. I don't know you, so I'm going to be hesitant to talk to you. I'm going to be hesitant to find out. You don't know me. You're not going to ask me certain things, or you're not going to want to get too deep because you don't know how I'm going to respond. And we've got to get through that. And we've got to show that love of Christ. We've got to have a little back and forth, give and take, and we can't just look at everybody like they're the enemy. And that's, sometimes it's not easy to do, but that's what we have to do.
It's really hard, because a lot of times these things are going to require me to change something about the way I approach the world, or about what I actually do. They might actually be inconvenient, and those are hard for us. And sometimes they touch on things that we hold really deeply and close to us, like things that are our own values and convictions. 4 years ago, Colin Kaepernick took a knee during the national anthem, right? And he was trying to protest police brutality. And there was an outcry over the protest, right? The outcry was over the protest, and there was very little talk, actually, of the issue he was protesting. My question is, what does right activism look like? What is the right kind of protest? And how do we avoid the polarization and the politicization of everything that happens in those moments?
Yeah, I think there's probably 2 steps, and what Colin and some of the players were doing was trying to shine a light on the problem, and they were trying to raise awareness. And they said, how can we best do that? We can have a press conference and maybe nobody will listen. We can talk about it and nobody will listen. But hey, if we do something during the national anthem, it'll get the attention. And that's what they were really trying to do. But then once you get the attention and you shine the light on it, then what can we do to build and make things better? And I think that's where we are now. We have an idea of what the problems are and what the issues are. So now we've got to work together and find ways we can build bridges and make a difference and make changes. And I'm really proud of some of the guys in the NFL. They have done some things in their communities with organizing police ride-alongs and community activities where they've gotten law enforcement and students together, where they've gone and done things in terms of building bridges. And I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to look for ways to build bridges now.
Sometimes it takes longer for people to hear the message, right? For the message to get across. And so sometimes what happens is then it escalates, right? The type of protest escalates. And at some level there is a line that we shouldn't cross. When it comes to like violent protest is probably not the answer. What does it look like to push the envelope, and where's the line?
Well, I think that's where, and you and I were kind of talking about this, what can this group do, or what can we do? As a predominantly white setting, how do we make a difference? I think we've got to respond, because it's one thing to say protest shouldn't be violent and protests should stay within this parameters. But if people are protesting and, hey, I can take a knee during the national anthem, and that didn't seem to do it. And so I'm going to protest a little differently. I'm going to protest a little more, and you still don't seem to hear me. What do I have to do to get you to hear me? And I'm not justifying it, but that's kind of the thought process. Hey, you don't hear me? I gotta.
Yeah.
Do you hear me now? Do you hear me now?
At some level, protest
Yeah.
is the voice of the unheard, right?
Yes.
For those people who
Yeah.
haven't been heard, they're crying out, and the
So-
cry keeps getting louder and louder and louder. And so I guess I hear you
sometimes
saying
to
it.
get me from shaking you,
Yeah.
it's I hear you.
We've got to be
I
quicker
hear
to
you.
listen,
Yeah.
right? I mean, in James he says, you need to be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry. When Colin Kaepernick took a knee, the anger and the vitriol was off the charts, right? We were not quick to listen. We were quick to get angry and slow to listen. So there's some ways we've got it flipped, and I think that is a place that we can start.
Amen.
Go.
I was just going to say, we just have to, there was a bracelet. I'm a little older than a lot of people here, but there was a bracelet, WWJD.
I remember him. Yeah.
At one time. What
I
would
think you
Jesus
still find him at Goodwill.
do?
Yeah.
Yes. But I think we
It
have
was
to
actually a
think-
book. That
Yeah,
came from
okay,
it
I
as
didn't
well,
know it
yeah.
was a book, but
It wasn't called WWJD, but it came from a book. The question.
But we have to think about what would Jesus do if he saw things going on that weren't right? If he saw some social injustice, would he say, well, we just have to keep our church as holy and pure as we can be and don't worry about anybody else? Or would he say, no, we've got to try to go out and fix this? And I think Jesus would say, we've got to try to fix it.
So you mentioned we're in a predominantly white community right here. About 2.2% of Eugene is black, right? So, I mean, walking down the street, every 50th person, maybe. And so how in Eugene can we support people of color, support black Americans, and start to make a difference and affect change, even though we're this little small church in a small community that's predominantly white?
I think the first thing we can do, and I always go back to the book of Acts and Jesus telling the disciples that, hey, you're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. But he told them to start in Jerusalem, which is where they live. And I think the best thing we can do is start in our homes and build that with our children and our families and say, you know what, in our house, this is what we're going to do. Like Joshua said, for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord and we're going to treat people right and we're going to think justly and think mercifully in that. And then we all have a sphere of influence, and that can be anywhere. That can be where you work, that can be in your neighborhood, but you're going to have some discussions with people. And to be able to stand up and say, speak for Christ, and when you hear things that aren't right, speak up about it. And I tell you, I have to do that a lot. I'm in black settings, and this goes both ways. Don't think it doesn't. I have to be in black settings where people will say, white people always do this. The police always do this. And I have to say, no, wait a minute. No, my uncle is the chief of police in Detroit, Michigan. He doesn't do that.
Yeah.
So don't say many police may do that, but not all police. I have white friends. I have white teammates. I have white players on our team that don't do that. And they have my back. So we can't say, and it's a tough conversation to have sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think so. You ask what you can do, even if you never come in contact with a black person. Okay? Starting in your home and in your sphere of influence, you can make a difference in how people think.
That's great. So sometimes it's hard to start small, right? Sometimes we want to change the world. I'm married to a world changer. My wife has ideas all the time of the way she's going to change the world. And for a while she worked in Haiti. And so we got to go, and actually it popped up on her feed this morning, a picture of our son meeting, he was 3 at the time, another 3-year-old Haitian boy. And we had walked into this village where there's no other white people. I don't think these kids had ever seen a white child. My son was blonde, blue-eyed, like toe-headed as can be, and all the kids are gathering around him and touching, right? And there's this sense that he's totally foreign, but they want to engage. And we get up there and we realize anything that we can do is just a drop in the bucket. to what's going on in Haiti and poverty and other kind of things. Well, a lot of times we want to solve the whole thing. And when I would take teams down there, I would say, you know what, you can't solve the whole thing, but you can engage with people. You can start with one conversation. But there are other organizations, like here, there are movements going on of people who are trying to affect massive change, and some of them, like Black Lives Matter. I believe that Black Lives Matter, but I don't necessarily agree with everything that the movement stands for. So what does it look like when we want to be a part of a larger movement of change, but the specific movement, we can't get behind all the things? How do we go side by side with people who are working to those things and not compromise other things that we hold dear?
I struggle with that too, and I think we have to keep Christ first and understand that that's what we're really promoting. That's what we're standing behind, and we're going forward for the cause of Christ. And we want to embrace the good things that Christ would embrace. We want to point people to Him and do things in a loving way, do things in an inclusive way, but we've got to honor the Lord, and so that's what I always base things on, and I'm very much that way. Black lives do matter. I am totally behind that, and I want people to know that and honor that. There's an organization called Black Lives Matter that doesn't have the same philosophical things, the same Christian heart that I have, and so I don't want people to think that I support all of that, but I support the concept. I think we just have to keep that out front.
How do we make that distinction? I think because people quickly hear a word or a phrase, right, and jump all over a church or whoever. Like I've seen just on my Facebook feed friends who they're reading a book like White Fragility, or they're mentioning the hashtagging Black Lives Matter, and people just jump all over that.
How can you support that? And I think we have to really be specific and tell people, hey, this is what I support. I support equality, I support love, I support Christ. That's exactly what happened with Colin Kaepernick and the players. How can you support that? He doesn't stand for the national anthem. He's not American. All of that, and say, well, you know what? I might support standing for the national anthem. I believe in that, but I'm listening to him. I'm hearing him, and he is talking about what's going on in their community. I can support that. We need change. Even though I disagree with kneeling for the national anthem, I can still support his purpose, his cause.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that. Well, I had you guys text me questions, and I got one person said doing great, someone else said hi. That's all I got. So it didn't work. It seemed like a good idea at the time.
Does anybody have a question?
But I would love to open it up for questions and allow you guys to just ask Tony. Keep it towards this issue if we can, these kind of issues. I know somebody was asking, could you get them Peyton Manning's phone number? But maybe not those questions for now. So, Clint.
When you hear white people respond, well, all lives matter, how do you hear that?
Good. I don't.
Let me repeat the question just so people online and everybody else can hear it. He said, Tony, how do you feel when you hear people respond, all lives matter?
I don't take that as a negative. Some people, and again, we politicize it. Someone says Black Lives Matter and people get upset. Well, you're trying to say my life doesn't matter. No, that's not what they're trying to say. And then when you say, well, all lives matter, then Black Lives Matter, people get upset. You're trying to say Black lives don't matter. I believe in that. And to me, it should just be lives matter. But it is all lives. It's black lives, white lives, all lives. It's just become political. So you have to kind of dodge that. And I try to disarm that by saying, well, Jesus says, and that usually gives you a little more grace and latitude. Jesus says lives matter. Jesus says young lives matter. Jesus says old lives matter. Jesus says lives in the womb matter. They all matter, including Black lives.
Somebody actually texted me a question. We're going to go with it, and it's a good one. How do you be thoughtful and do nuance in a soundbite culture? We have a culture that's all about sound bites, and everybody wants theirs, and they don't want to listen to the whole thing. How do we do nuance?
You have to really, really be careful. I learned that in television. I went from a coach where you're kind of talking to your group and you have as much time as you want to TV, and my boss at NBC said, the very first thing you say is all people are going to remember. So make sure what you say first is what you really mean and what you want to get out. And I made a mistake my first couple of years on TV. I would say, oh, this guy's no good, and here's why. And nobody heard the here's why. All they heard was so-and-so's no good.
They took it as a character judgment, right?
Yeah. So you really have to be careful and be thoughtful and pray about it. I was doing things like this for the last probably month. Zoom calls and town hall meetings all over the country. And I was exhausted from praying because I just prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed. Lord, give me the right thing. Don't let me say the wrong thing. Let me be thoughtful. And people would get very frustrated sometimes because they'd ask me a question and I would think, I'd go, because I want to get it exactly right. So I think in that soundbite culture, we have to really think about it, make sure we're saying exactly what we mean, and pray about it before we say it.
I think there's a great deal. As someone who holds a microphone also and says things that get repeated and recorded, there is a sense to which there's humility that goes into it to recognize that I don't have all the answers at this moment.
And you know what? That is not a bad answer either.
Right.
I don't know.
The most freeing thing I ever learned as a pastor, when I learned it was okay to say, I don't know. Let me think about that, study that a little bit, and can we have a conversation about that later? I think that's an absolutely okay thing to say, especially with issues like this where I know I'm really learning that I'm not the expert and don't have a lot to offer, but I've got a lot to ask. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Trish. Speak loudly.
You're talking a little bit about this idea of natural defensiveness, right? And how that's kind of our first thing. And I kind of relate that to this idea of like, but I'm a good person, right? So I don't do something wrong. What do you think is a better way to define ourselves so that we're prepared to take feedback and critique and learn from other people?
I think the best way to look at it is I am a good person, but I'm not perfect, and I need to grow, and I need to learn, and there are a lot of things that I don't really know about. So if I can take in information, it's going to make me better. And so that's the way I would look at it. Hey, I want to grow, I want to learn, and help me grow and help me learn. And even if it's uncomfortable, even if it makes me feel like, hey, I'm taking a step back, eventually I'm going to be a better person.
Another question came via text. Even though we don't have a huge black population in Eugene, we do have a handful of black college athletes at the University of Oregon. How can we encourage and support the black college athletes in our community?
It's one of those I'm going to have to think about for a second before I answer. I think just, you may not ever get a chance to talk to them individually. You may never run across them, but even writing a letter of encouragement. Hey, we're glad you're here, and we support you, and we're proud of you. Just a simple letter like that can make a big difference. I know when I was playing and I'd get a letter like that, young man, David, came up to me and just talked to me a little bit, and he said he did a book report and he wanted to show me a couple things, and it lifted my spirits. It made my day. So just even something like that, just writing that letter, if he had not met me, but just writing me a letter, hey, I know about you, and I really think you're cool.
Letters are a pretty good idea, right? Nobody writes letters anymore. Like, you go out to the mail and you get the mail, and most of the time it's bills and other things you don't want. But you see a handwritten addressed letter, and I think with COVID, that's one of the things I've noticed is people have actually started doing that a little more. What if we would do that when it's not COVID to people we don't even know? There's something encouraging about people realizing that, knowing that somebody else cares about them and would take the time to invest in them in that way. So, more questions? Anybody else have another question? Daniel, can you speak it up loud?
Um, so all the learners were like, I don't think the public is ready for this. Well, like, I'm not really talking about the public, but how did your TV coach react when you came in?
How did your team react?
How did my team react?
When you first became their head
Yeah,
coach?
you know, it's. I think especially the African American players, they were really proud. There were so many of those guys that told me, "Hey, you were the first African American coach I've ever had," and they wanted to do well. They wanted me to do well, but I had to be the coach for everybody. I couldn't just be the coach for the black players. I had to make everybody know that I was their coach, and it was a fun process. And most of those guys, I don't think I had anyone, white player, black player, anybody that didn't want to play for me because of the color of my skin or who I was. I just, it was great. It really was. And I think that's the one neat thing about sports. When you get behind a reason, a cause, hey, we want to win a Super Bowl, and we're all in this together. So it doesn't matter what you think or what religion you are or where you grew up or what you look like. We can all put that beside us because we have one goal. And I think we've got to get to that in America, that we've got to have one goal to make our country the best it can be.
Just answer my next question. I think that's true, right? I think we're definitely at a place where we have polarized over a lot of issues. Race is one of them. Are there some practical ways you feel like we can start to have a common goal again to work for, right? Work towards. I think there have been moments in our history where something happens to our country that everybody's like, okay, we can get behind this cause. At the moment, I don't know if people feel like we have that. How could we make this a moment to do that?
I thought the COVID might be that, but so, no, I really did. I thought that, hey, we've got a common enemy now. It's this germ, this disease, and we'll all come together to try to defeat that. But then this situation with George Floyd happened right in the middle of it, and I think what we've got to understand is if we don't defeat this, we're going to implode as a country. And Abraham Lincoln said it, a house divided cannot stand. And if we think we're going to stand and be two separate countries, it's not going to work. So we have to if we want to see America grow.
Some of these things do take generations, and I love that we've got some children out here coming and hanging out with us. So what can white children in our predominantly white community do to support their friends of color at school, at the skate park, on the street? And how can they let their friends of color know they support them? And then what do kids of color need to hear from their peers?
I think we all just have to be kids, and we all just have to be friends, and I don't think there's anything special. You don't have to say, hey, I know you're black, and so I'm going to make this effort to really reach out to you. I remember growing up, and it was just kids, and we had fun together. And the same thing on a team. When you start playing on a team, it's, hey, we're going to win, and we're going to be good, and I'm going to throw you the ball because you can catch it. And I think that's what we have to get to. That I don't think it's going to take anything special, but just making sure that you don't let other people turn you away from being who you really are. That's one of the things that can happen. Other people say, oh, you shouldn't hang out with him, or I'd be careful about being friends with her. And you know that's not right. You can't let other people dictate what you're going to do.
So one of the things Jesus said that was a little divisive, he said, I have come and I'm going to divide families among themselves, parents against their children. I think this is one of those issues generationally that people see differently. And someone asked the question, how do younger Americans speak to their parents, their grandparents, or older Americans who have come from a different place and who have different perspectives on this that are maybe not keeping up with where we need to get to?
Yeah, I think you really have to approach it, as I said, when I try to talk to people, it's what the Bible says and what Jesus says. Hey, what would God say about this? What does the Bible say about this? Does the Bible say it's okay to differentiate and treat people differently, or did Jesus come for everybody?
what happens if you have a different worldview than even your family? What if they're not coming from a Christian worldview that says we can do that? Because I think there needs to be some coming together on those things. We can't yet assume that people who are not followers of Jesus yet have that same lens that we do to view the world.
Yeah.
And so,
That's one of those I don't know questions that I have
Darn
to
it.
answer. You. I don't know.
Keep
Because
looking for someone
I
who can
really
answer
don't
that
know.
one for
I
me.
don't know what to tell people if it's not with Christ. Hey, do this because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Do this because it's going to make things better. Most people, if they're not coming from a Christian point of view, that's not going to make sense to them. And so I really don't know what to tell those guys. Now, on a football team, I could tell them, hey, if you're prejudiced and you don't like black players, you got to get over that because we need these guys to win. And if you want to win, you need that. But in a real world situation where you can make choices, that's a hard way to go. I know for sure I can, approach you if we're talking about Christ and what God says. But if you say, well, I don't really believe in God and I don't believe in all that, I don't know how to fix you.
That's fair. Another question came in via text. I think I might know how you're going to answer this one, but I'm going to let you answer it. How do we balance showing love, interest, and support to the people of color in our community without being nosy or intrusive and like codependent with them? Like, how do we help and not like get in your personal space like you shook me earlier?
Yeah, I think it's hard, but try not to look at them any differently. Try not to think of it as, oh, this is I've got to reach out to this. I've got to do more. Just be yourself. Just treat them like you would anyone else. And if you do that, that's all people are asking for.
I think as someone who came late to the party, sometimes that's hard, like trying to make up for lost time.
No,
And
don't feel like you have to
make up for lost time. Yeah.
Just be nice to me. Like you met me, just treat me like someone you just met, and I'm good. Not that, hey, I don't have any black friends, so I really need to get to
I
know
really
you.
need you right now. I'm gonna try not to text you every day now, Tony. Anybody else questions? These have been fantastic questions. Oh, did somebody text me one just now? All right.
I think this one.
We'll take this one and then right there. How did adopting your children come about?
You know how that really started, and it's my wife, Lauren. She had adopted children in her family and was around that all the time, and it was something she really wanted to do. And so we started to investigate it, and the agency that we looked at talked about the need for African American adopted parents. We spoke to this lady, and she said, we've got all of these. We work with women. We don't want them to have abortions. We tell them we're going to place their kids in Christian homes, but we have a shortage of African American parents. And I said, wow, that's, Lauren and I talked about being pro-life and we don't want people to have abortion, but now you're saying if they don't, there's no place for these kids to go. That's not right. And so that's how I got in. So Lauren always had the heart for it.
I love it because at some level we have convictions, right, that we believe in. And when that moment comes that you realize this is the thing that I can do about it. You can't do all the things, but in those moments, to connect that conviction to that actual practice. I think that's the readiness. With some of these issues, we want to solve it now. And I think you communicated to me that there will be a time to act, but it might not be yet. It might be the time to prepare and to listen and to get ready. And there might be that moment where right in front of you is the thing that you can actually do. Not the thing that changes necessarily the whole world, but it changes the thing right in front of you. So,
Amen.
thanks for sharing that. Right here.
You had mentioned earlier that there was some concern that the Christian faith might limit some of the opportunities you might have. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how that actually played out over your career, and do you see those attitudes changing now?
You want to repeat that question? Or?
Yeah, he had mentioned earlier that when he was interviewing for coaching jobs, he was concerned that maybe it was his Christian faith that was an obstacle to him getting hired. How has that played out in your later career? And
I had another interview where guy asked me that question. He said, I've done, we talked about a lot of things, and at the end he said, I've done a lot of research on you. I know you don't use profanity, you don't raise your voice, you don't yell at players. How are you going to get this high testosterone group that I have, how are you going to get them to do what they should do? And I said, well, as a Christian, I believe that this is how you do it. You develop a relationship, you build a relationship, you get those guys to respect you, you show them that you're competent, and because of the relationship we have, the love that we have for each other, they'll do what I want them to do because they really love and respect me. And that owner looked at me and said, that will never work in the NFL. So I didn't get that job either. But there was a lot of people thought that. I remember when the chaplain program came into the NFL, and a lot of teams said they didn't want Christian chaplains, they didn't want Fellowship of Christian Athletes coming in because the team wouldn't be as competitive, and they'd get all these guys who didn't care if they won or lost. And people have a strange view of Christianity, but I think how can I be humble and say this? But
Just say it.
I think that was my mission, and I hired some Christian coaches who went on and did the same thing. And Lovie Smith and Jim Caldwell and Mike Tomlin have taken teams and used the same approach and won. And so I think we're kind of battling that stereotype and showing that you can honor the Lord and be very good coaches as well.
I haven't met any of those guys, but I did once meet Mike Tomlin's pastor.
Okay.
I was just riding in a car on our way to a conference. It was an interesting experience. He was a really cool guy. He was this redheaded white guy in inner city church in Pittsburgh, and it was a cross-racial church. It was a really fun conversation. Another question: how can we as Christians speak out against broken systems while still supporting individuals in those systems? With examples being policemen and a prejudiced criminal justice system.
Yeah, I think we, first of all, can't paint everybody in one picture and say everybody's like this, so therefore, we can't deal with them. I think we have to try to help out and try to change what needs to be changed, and we've got to try to support those that need to be supported and uplifted. And we got to pray for our police department. We've got to pray for our officers. We've got to pray for our government leaders. We've got to pray for the people that are putting laws in. And we do have to, try to fix the system. The Minneapolis Police Department, I happen to know for a fact, I have a friend who, his son wanted to be a policeman in the Minneapolis Police Department, the same where George Floyd got killed. And he went to the University of Minnesota, where I went to school. He took criminal justice. His whole life he wanted to be a policeman in his hometown. He took the personality test, and they told him he was too compassionate, and they didn't hire him. We've got to change that.
Yeah.
We've got to change that. I think compassion would be a good thing for a policeman to have.
Yeah. So I know you also work with an organization called All Pro Dad, and I got a question here from my mother-in-law, actually, who's not here, so she must be watching online. We're just curious about the cultural impact of the breakdown of the family, and especially African-American families without dads in the home. How, what impact do you see on children not having fathers in the home, and how do we?
I got started with All Pro Dad for that very reason, and not just African-American children, although it is a high rate now, but when I became coach of the Tampa Bay Bucks, our pastor at that time had this fabulous prison ministry. His name was Abe Brown, and he took me on a couple of prison visits with him. And I was blown away because I expected to see all these older, hardened criminals, and I saw all these 20, 21, 22-year-old kids basically in there. And I asked Reverend Brown, I said, what's the common denominator? He said, it's not race, it's not education, it's not socioeconomic. None of these guys grew up with their dad. That's the number one thing that leads to this dysfunction. That's what Satan has used. He's splitting up families, and he's trying to take the dads away from being the head of the household like God designed it. that's where our nation is really getting attacked. And again, that's what we've got to preach to people. You know, this is the godly model. This is what Christ wants, and it's men being the head of the household and standing up for their responsibility. So I got involved with All Pro Dad, and that's what we're trying to get across in a way that it's not overtly Christian, but it's all Christian principles. We've got to get back to that.
What does success look like in working with All Pro Dad? What do you get to see that has been positive changes or benefits from it? Do you see like stories of change?
We do. We see men get involved and really understand their role. I think we've been brainwashed into thinking that the moms nurture the family and the dads are the breadwinners. If we provide financially, that we've done our job. And just getting guys to learn that no, being a spiritual leader, being an emotional helper, all of these things are part of being a dad, and that's important. And you know, the impact dads have on their kids, and to have men tell me that, say I didn't really understand that until I got involved, or I'm doing that better now. It's really gratifying.
Cool, love that. Have time for a couple more questions if anybody has a couple more. If any of the kids have questions. I love that Daniel asked one. No more, this is your chance.
Did you maintain a relationship with that teacher that reached out to you in high school?
Mr. Rockmore, yes. He passed away not too long ago, sadly, but yeah, he was really a neat guy. He came, was one of the first African American administrators. He's an assistant principal. We were shocked when he came in because it's a predominantly white school, and he would sit at the lunch tables with us, and he, you know, walk down the halls with us, and we first would kind of look, and what is this guy doing, the principal? But he was a relationship builder. And so 4 years later, when he calls me on the phone, I went over to his house because he was more than just the principal. He was somebody that I knew cared about me. And it was, you know, it was really amazing. But I told him several times after that, you know, if you hadn't called me in the middle of the summer and when you hadn't seen me for 3 years, I'd be doing something else now. But that taught me, when I got older and became a coach, that taught me the value of relationships. So I used to go in the lunchroom and sit with my players, and I got the same eye at first. Well, why is the head coach sitting here, you know?
I must be in trouble.
Yeah, yeah. But he taught me a really important lesson.
So aside from your father, who I know is a big influence in your life, who were some of the other maybe heroes or people who you looked up to, who you respected and you learned from? Both how to be a man, how to be a Christian man, but how to address these kind of issues in the world and make your way.
Coach Noel was important for me. He was my first coach in the NFL. My roommate with the Steelers was a guy named Donnie Shell. He was 4 years older than me, the strongest Christian athlete I'd ever been around. And he took me like a little brother and got me to where I was reading my Bible. I wasn't really growing much as a Christian when I was that age, 21. And he said, hey, if you want to be a man, you've got to grow and you got to know what Jesus says about things. And he was really important in my life.
Anybody else going once? No, Daryl.
As far as like the kind of leadership role you talked about, and the head coach, ownership, and working that, what do you feel like the good steps are to pushing that gap?
I don't think rules are going to do it. I really think it's got to be a heart change, and it's got to be somehow the owners understanding, first of all, that it's going to be better for them. It's going to make their teams better because they're going to look at all the possibilities and not just half of them or a third of them. But I think it really does have to be a heart issue, and I don't know how we fix that. You know, as I said, when I came in the league, no one thought it was any big deal that we didn't have any assistant coaches, no head coaches, and just a sprinkling of assistant coaches. It didn't even faze them. Well, now we understand that, and what do we do about it? How can it be done? I don't think it'll be legislating it. I think it'll be somehow getting those guys to understand that's important.
Somebody else texted me one more. Says the gospel will never fully align to one political side or the other. There's things on both sides. How can we depoliticize these situations that we're facing to a point we can make some progress?
Yeah. We're a very political society right now. I know several years ago, I met Colin Powell, and I asked him why. Well, I said, we need you to run for president.
Yeah.
And he said, I can't do that because as soon as I run for president, half the people will automatically say my ideas are bad. And that's where we are right now. And so I think we've got to keep pointing to Christ and keep doing the things that God would want us to do, not say, hey, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican. Doesn't matter what side you support, but what would God say about it? And I was doing one of these with the United States Congress, a Zoom call with everybody, and that's the one thing I told them. I said, hey, you're representing your cities, you're representing your state, you're representing your political party, but at the end of the day, you've got to represent God, and what does God want us to do? And that's got to be as stronger than me being a black man, me being a Republican or a Democrat, me being from the South or the North. All that's got to come behind Jesus.
Well, I think we're going to try and wrap up because it's getting close to 8.
Is it?
Yeah, I know, right? I can tell because I'm starting to want to put my jacket on. Couple of things really quick. Are there any resources that you would recommend to us to educate ourselves on some of these issues? I think Scripture, obviously, we need to soak ourselves in that to know what God would want us to do, but there are other things that can broaden our thinking, our understanding, our toolbox for how we deal with people.
Yeah, I would first of all recommend the Bible. That's always the best place to go. But there's 2 books that if you're a reader, White Fragility you mentioned from a white standpoint, and Benjamin Watson has a book called Under Our Skin that really talks about the same thing from a black perspective. And I think they're 2 good books. Benjamin's especially from a Christian perspective. He talks about race, he talks about racism, but he does it from a biblical perspective.
Is there anything else you would want us as a community to hear? Things that we need to just remember going forward, things that you want us to practice, things that if we walked away from here, you wouldn't want us to miss?
I think it would be the last thing you mentioned, the letter that I kind of wrote. The very last thing in that was Romans 12:21. Don't be overcome by evil. Overcome evil with good. And I think that's how we have to approach it.
Thank you so much, Tony, for taking the time to be here. You give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was super fun to do, and I know for many of us, we're all in the middle of this. Like Tony said, we're in this thing together, and we need to learn how to come together. And so one of the things that we want to do as a church is be people who are willing to participate in the ongoing conversation. Be people who listen first and are slow to speak and slow to become angry. I know most of you. I've met most of you. I know the rest of you were invited here by someone, and we want to be people who are open to this conversation and are open to continuing to process these things with you. I love that you recommended a couple of resources. Also, one that can be a little divisive. White Fragility a little bit has been a hot button book, and I think it is okay to read things from perspectives that aren't yours. In fact, it's incredibly helpful. If we're going to learn how to listen, we've got to listen to people who aren't like us. And so I would just encourage you, find some of those things. One of the things that's been most helpful is just going back to reread MLK's letter from Birmingham jail. And if you're going to start somewhere, you want something that'll take you half an hour and you can digest and get a picture of just kind of where we've been, but where we need to go. I feel like he could have written it yesterday, and it would apply to where we're at right now. So another one I just read that was I found encouraging is Let Justice Roll Down, John Perkins.
Yeah.
His autobiography and his experience. You got something to say about that?
John Perkins is another one that's just a tremendous perspective from a Christian point of view.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've kind of been exploring this as a church in our sermon series the last few weeks. So if you want some teaching on it from Scripture. Those things are available at allthingsneweugene.com or on our Facebook page at All Things New. So with that, can I pray for you, Tony, before you take
Please.
off? And just
Please, amen.
God, thanks for Tony. Thank you for his willingness to come and be a part of this gathering where we explore how we can be a part of justice in our community in the way that you would want us to be. Give us wisdom, give us ears to listen. God, I pray that you would give Tony continued wisdom as he speaks to the Baylor football team tomorrow and all the other people that he gets the opportunity. Thank you that you've raised him up for a time like this, that he can be one of the voices nationally that's speaking to these issues and doing it in a way that is humble and helpful and wise. I pray that you would give him the words over and over, give him the endurance and the patience and the persistence to keep doing this work. And we ask that justice would roll down, that we would get to see things operate as you have designed them to, where there is equality, there is peace, and there is hope. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Well, thank you guys for coming. Have a marvelous evening, and look forward to talking with you guys more.